So, hi everybody. Welcome to the fourth webinar in this series organized by MDO and TDO. We'll wait a few minutes for participants to join before we set off with our webinar. Can I ask participants to keep their mute on, their mic on mute in the meantime? We'll give it one more minute. Okay, I guess let's get going. So welcome everybody to this fourth webinar in a series of webinars organized by MDO Management Company and the Director's Office, replacing the roundtable event that we usually hold every year. For obvious reasons, we had to cancel that, and hopefully we can put it back on in the next year. I'm Paul de Quant. I'm a partner at the Director's Office, and we will be discussing today whether complex and heavy regulations are pushing the entry barrier for new funds too high. I'll be joined today by three distinguished panelists: Jérôme Benny, who is a partner of Elvingerhorst Prussen; Luc de Vet, who for years ran Citco Luxembourg and is now a partner at One Group Solutions; and Paul Carr, who is the CEO of East Capital Asset Management in Luxembourg. Today's topic is quite dear to me because before embarking in 2012 on a new road as independent director, in a previous life I ran a small investment boutique. We established funds in Luxembourg in 2003, actually with Jérôme's help at the time. And our fund had as a sort of at its peak 600 million under management, but it took a few years to get there. And I wonder regularly if we would have had the patience and the financial staying power to set up and run that fund in today's regulatory environment. Things were much less complex then. Just think of a world without AIFMD, without GDPR, without FATCA, without beneficial ownership declaration registrations, and without a responsable de respect or de contrôle, to name a few. Today's our objective is to involve you in the discussion, so please do ask questions using your Q&A button at any time. The idea is to, among panelists, ask some questions first and have a general discussion around the topic. But we welcome your questions and hope you will participate as we go along. May I perhaps start with asking Jérôme for you to first give your perspective on this topic from your experience in bringing many managers to the market in Luxembourg. How have you seen the chances for smaller managers to be successful develop over the years? Do you feel there are real obstacles? Are there solutions that that exist for managers to come into the business?
Thank you, Paul. I think there's no doubt that there are less and less funds and less smaller funds. If you look at the CSF statistics that they publish every month, it's quite interesting to see that, generally speaking, the assets grow, but the number of funds drops very sharply, and the curve is quite impressive. There are clearly Luxembourg reasons, but not only. I believe we can find causes at 4 levels. The first one is the international level, then you have the EU level, then you have reasons that are specific to other jurisdictions, and then finally the Luxembourg level. And if I may, I'll quickly go through the 4 levels. The first one, the international level, I think it's quite clear to me at least that investors have less appetite for smaller funds. That generally speaking, they prefer investing with large managers. And that might have to do as well with passive funds. The fact that passive funds have eaten a portion of the market, that those passive funds are only successful if they're extremely large. And I believe that that has created a general trend towards the larger managers. Then you have the European level, and there I find it very interesting to note that the EU, and they say it publicly, want the European fund landscape to look like the US one, which is deemed to be more mature and more efficient. They feel that having bigger funds and less funds is in the interest of investors, because costs should be lower. And there are a number of causes. I'm not saying that all this has been done in order to reduce the number of funds, but it has had that effect. And it goes from the need to have a management company for UCITS to other regulations, including those that you've mentioned, Paul, EMIR, benchmark disclosures, ESG. All this implies additional costs, and it makes it very difficult for smaller managers to run a boutique and to run a small fund. But at the EU level, I think what is really key is the ban on retrocessions. I believe that many of the smaller managers managed to attract money because they were offering very significant rebates on management fees. And that has become much more difficult now. And therefore, from what I see, a number of smaller managers don't really have a cutting edge. They don't really have a good reason to invite an intermediary to raise money for their funds. Then thirdly, very quickly, sometimes there are causes in other jurisdictions. Like, for example, what has created a significant impact on Luxembourg was the fact that until a few years ago, Swiss managers didn't have to be regulated. And so many of those could set up Luxembourg funds. Now, the threshold to become regulated was very demanding, and a number of them have had to close their funds. And then finally, there's the Luxembourg level. I would say 3 things at that level. First, I believe that a number of service providers are not interested in smaller funds, and that doesn't apply to lawyers, because we typically are paid on the basis of time spent. But those paid on net assets, whether they're depository, management companies, administrative agents, they tend to put the barrier to entry fairly high, at a minimum usually of 100 million. But in addition to that, you clearly have the CSF time to market. I've experienced that for a number of managers. It has been difficult, because to create a new UCITS, it would not be abnormal that it takes like 6 months or sometimes 7 or 8 months. And obviously, if it slips, it can be worse. And those managers might have had seed money or a window opportunity that might have been gone. And then finally, one has to also admit that sometimes the CSF approach to supervision has been difficult to deal with by smaller managers who, for example, I have an example in mind where a Latin American manager wants to create a UCITS, but they want to be able to have their own local funds feeding into the UCITS, and the CSF indeed has questioned that setup, especially on the AML KYC front. And I'm not saying that they were wrong, but there's no doubt that the CSF's approach to supervision has become much more stringent, which might deter a number of small managers. But I'll pause there. You're on mute, Paul.
Thanks, Jeroen, for that overview. Luc, you've worked in the Lux fund industry as a service provider for a wide range of investment funds for many years. What is your view on the impact of the regulatory watershed on the ability of talented but smaller managers to establish themselves? Are there any solutions?
Yeah, Jeroen, thank you for a very good introduction to the topic. I will try not to repeat too many things. So it's obvious that regulations don't make things easier. So whether you're small or big, the watershed of regulation has certainly not made things easier. Small managers have a different issue than big managers. I think especially a cost perspective makes an additional regulation and an extra issue for small managers. What Jeroen mentioned, availability of service providers, the willingness of institutional investors, and certainly if you look at AIFMD, which is aimed at institutional investors, professional investors, and they don't want to own 50% of a fund. So if you're a small manager, it becomes very difficult to attract money from that side. All things that Jeroen mentioned. So I will focus more on the solution. First of all, it's not necessary to set up your own usage management company or AIFM if you feel that you don't have the volume of business to support that in a cost-efficient way. It's also to avoid a long time to market. It's probably a much more efficient way to use a third-party management company / AIFM. And there are plenty of those in Luxembourg that are looking for extending their own businesses. So I see that is a very helpful way for a small manager to get started. It obviously adds a cost, even if portfolio management can still be delegated to the initiator of the fund, to the small manager, then still you have that extra layer of AIFM or usage management company in Luxembourg, which is a third party and which will not do that for free. Of course, it takes a certain part of work away, so it makes the work that the small manager would have to do, it reduces that, it makes it more efficient on that side. So potentially the fee that has to be paid to the management company can come out of the fee that would otherwise be paid to the portfolio manager, who includes the AIFM or usage management company tasks. I see another, and then we're looking more at product, I see another area where compared to 10, 15 years ago, things have become a bit more easy, and that is that in Luxembourg we have unregulated structures. And if you go 15 years ago, everything had to be regulated, whether it was usage or alternative. That's no longer the case. You can have an SCSP, you can have a RAVE, which is unregulated and which makes life for everyone easier, but also for small managers.
Okay, thank you, Luc. Paul, you have I guess a sort of unique perspective, being the CEO of an investment management company, and perhaps you can share with us how you've experienced the regulatory regime developing in Luxembourg. Have you doubted ever that there was a business case for smaller managers to establish themselves? Obviously, East Capital Management is not a smaller manager now, but you started off with more modest means and size in 15 years ago. So what is your perspective on this topic?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks a lot for the invitation. And yeah, I was reflecting on the fact that I'd been invited because I was representing a small manager, which was a bit maybe not how we see ourselves. But yeah, thanks for clarifying. So yeah, just maybe two words to quickly introduce ourselves. So yeah, I work for the East Capital Group. It's a diversified asset management group. It's independent. We run different ranges of funds inside of the group, and we have very much an ESG focus, and we have hedge funds, real estate funds, long equity, and then fixed income. So pretty much covering most of the asset classes, and all of those are managed from Luxembourg with our own Manco here. I mean, we started our journey as East Capital in Luxembourg in 2006 with Jerome's help, as I recall, and MDO actually, for that matter, in establishing a CCAF, which went live in 2007. As you say, it was a normal starting fund. We had a little bit of seed capital, but we needed to grow the assets. And I actually, embarked on a little bit of a journey in the preparation for this panel, just to go a bit down memory lane, and it got quite nostalgic actually, because it was interesting to compare the contracts and the service agreements that we needed to have in place in 2007 when we launched, compared to what we have today. And I mean, I need several files and folders now to store all of the different agreements and fee schedules for the whole myriad of things that we need to exist. And it's a much shorter and much neater folder back in 2006-07. So that just shows you that during this time we've had to deal with an onslaught of different kinds of regulations. Not only the developments in the UCITS, but also in MiFID and in AML and other topics as well. And I think on the reporting side, we barely reported much, and now I think we have to file hundreds of reports from our Manco each year. So definitely in that sense, and when you look at the fee schedules as well, you can reflect on the fact that I've spent 15 years trying to knock down those fees, and doing as good a job as we can. But the reality is that even though we have reduced, let's say, core costs for services, we need 5 times more services now than we needed back in those days. So it must be a very difficult prospect to consider entering Luxembourg as a small manager. And I think it's not only that cost, and maybe just to come back to Jerome's points and a little bit. I mean, obviously the cost pressure is one end of it, and the other end of it, which you alluded to, is the fee pressure. So we have seen that investors are prepared to pay less and less for fees. And you're also correct that the way in which those fees are shared has changed over time as well. So it's just squeezed from both directions. And that also then links into the distribution models, which you also touched on, which have changed a lot. And we can see that and definitely relate to the rise in the passive, the change in the IFA model, as you said, the change in the remuneration model. All these things make it harder to raise that initial capital beyond the seed capital, which you need to secure with your anchor investors. But beyond the seed capital, you need to get regular flows and build assets in order to attract the institutions, which usually would look for 100 million minimum before they're prepared to enter, and probably 1 or 2 years track record as well. So it's a patient business. Yeah, you asked me also in terms of comparing with other jurisdictions, and whether we regret our decision to establish here and also to establish as a UCITS. The short answer is absolutely not. We still see this as the principal and most attractive vehicle for international marketing and distribution. We still don't hardly ever receive a question. We market directly in just shy of 20 countries. We have investors from 60 globally. So not many occasions do we get anybody questioning our Luxembourg status and the fact that we are a UCITS, and would we like to set up a German fund or a Swedish fund or a Singapore fund instead, because they would prefer it. It happens very, very rarely. And in terms of jurisdictions, we have a very much a Swedish heritage. So we do have Swedish UCITS. And back in 2005-6, we made that assessment that we wanted to be in a more recognized jurisdiction for our fund domicile, and we basically looked between Ireland and Luxembourg. And after some debate, we chose Luxembourg, and I believe we have never regretted that decision. Yeah, so I'll pause there and let you develop the conversation a bit now.
Because Paul, if I may, I think there are also opportunities. East Capital has been acquiring a number of businesses. I don't know if apart from local specific issues that some of those groups had faced, why do you have any idea on why they sold their business, and whether there were any commonalities amongst all those groups? Because you've made several acquisitions.
Yes, we have, and we have already covered some of the reasons why they may be interested, and it's largely shift in the distribution dynamics. It's maybe a pressure which is changing on the insurance and platform business, and IFA business that of course we have already seen through MiFID II, but increasingly starting to see on insurance business. So I mean, there's a myriad of reasons. It's also people just want an exit as they get older, or see an opportunity. Consolidation is a fairly common theme throughout most sectors. But actually, one interesting reflection on that is that, you know, as you say, we're very keen on acquisitions, and we look on a very permanent, ongoing basis for opportunities. And you would be surprised, actually, that a lot of small managers are very reluctant to consider selling, regardless of their circumstances. There's always this feeling that, you know, you're turning the corner, and it's, if you're an entrepreneur, that's your baby, and you want to hold it and fight for it as long as you can. So actually, the acquisition opportunities that have come our way have tended not to be the smallest ones, and we wouldn't necessarily not look at them either. It's really that they are not often very keen to discuss.
Do you feel that, I guess this is a general question to the panel, do you feel that that regulators are enough aware of the, first of all, the need to attract new blood to the market, and are trying to provide solutions for that? I mean, it seems to me that sort of the increasing complexity of the regulatory framework, it's a fact, and we all have to live with it, and you can you know, in some cases maybe it goes too far, in some other cases we really feel it's good, but the consequences, you know, does the regulator actually understand the need to provide openings for smaller managers to come in? Jérôme, maybe you have a first shot at that one. Or
I think one of the key issues there is not on UCITS, but on AFMD. And as we know, you have that concept of small managers with two thresholds: 100 million of assets and management, not per fund, but per manager, where you can have leverage and it can be open-ended. And then you have another threshold, 500 million, but for closed-ended and without leverage funds. And the reality is that 500 million, that is probably okay, but 100 million is just not the right threshold. You're too small, you can't really make money, and then as soon as you hit 100 million, you have to deploy, spend costs, deploy resources to have your own AIFM, and that is not making any financial sense until you reach about 700 million. So between 100 and 700, and I think 7 is when you make money, but presumably as from 500 million, it is probably the right move, but it's a long desert, and it means that small managers remain small. Whereas, as you said, Paul, ideally, we should foster small managers to hope to have the big managers of tomorrow. And the European regulation doesn't really help. And so, as Luc was saying, and I'll finish with that, I think the best route for smaller managers is to be hosted on someone else's platform, either a UCITS or AFMD. platform, or at least if they want to have their own fund, to use external service providers. But that is indeed at a slightly higher cost.
Just two comments on that, because I happen to take calls every now and again from people who are interested to set up actually their own fund, and if we could offer, or I could offer any advice to them in that. And it is interesting that they do have trouble in engaging with service providers. In the first case, you need to have a very strong business case for that. You need to have the right selection of people with the right experiences. Ideally, everybody wants deep pockets somewhere connected to that, which is not always easy. And the other reflection is that if they do get traction, I do unfortunately see that sometimes they get really terrible offers and get dragged into something which is actually quite expensive. So I think it's a bit of a a double-edged sword. We want to embrace startups, and we need that to fuel our industry. On the other hand, we don't want to have very, very small funds with high TRs. So we need to also help and select well. But once we think it's a good business model, we don't kill them with fees.
Yeah, perhaps I can add a different angle, because I personally don't believe that our regulator has ever targeted small managers in Luxembourg. I won't say that they tried to stop it, but really targeting, that was never the case. We used to have the promoter requirements, which were very difficult to meet for small managers. And now it's probably more set the regulations that have become excessive in certain areas. But I don't think that our regulator would in any way be really targeting small managers, whether it's through regulations or through lesser promoter requirements.
True, but if I may jump in, I sort of sympathize with the CSF. First, I think we have to recognize that we are a premium jurisdiction. It might be strange to say it like that, but in a way, we're like the German car manufacturing. And so in a way, it's not for us to devise the cheapest funds. And there's room for that. I must say, when I feel that a fund will not be properly hosted in Luxembourg, I think it's better that they do it in the Caymans or in Malta, and hopefully it will come back to Luxembourg later. But in a way, I also think that the CSF did well to decide to step up. And I think there's no doubt that the CSF now is not considered as a too flexible and funky regulator. I think they are now seen as a proper regulator. Now, I'm not saying that they're not exaggerating, and I'm not saying that there would be a way to stay in the first tier without trying to be first in class. So I think the CSF maybe could let a few things loose, but overall, the idea that we are a jurisdiction for more established fund managers, I think that is fine. It's just that, as I said before, it could still be the case, and if the EU allowed a small manager up to 300 million, we could still foster these, help them to grow, and that is, in my opinion, the difficult part.
But Jerome, the thing is, if you have a large US manager who has relative little business in Europe and always did that through reverse solicitation, so you know the stories, they now want to become in line with the regulations. So, okay, let's have a parallel fund structure. And the US part is 2 billion and the Luxembourg part, 100, perhaps 200 million. They normally consider what they have to do for Luxembourg and what they have to pay and et cetera, complex and far too expensive. And that is something, if we could find solutions for that. And again, I've said the unregulated structures absolutely help. But I do see that as it's not a small manager. but it is for what it manages for European investors. It is small. And also there, I do see that we reduce and we make it so complex, or we have made it so complex and so costly that it doesn't really attract that business, and it puts a hurdle for managers that potentially could be very interesting for Luxembourg.
I think, Jerome, you mentioned as one of the solutions the sort of platforms, sort of CCAF incubator platforms where small managers can can start on. Are there concrete successful examples of that in Luxembourg? How do they overcome sort of issues like branding, independence, etc. Among your clients? Do you have examples?
Yes, and for example, back to what Luc just said, I currently know of 2 US managers that are currently UCITS managers, but they're currently hosted both on Luxembourg platforms and Irish platforms, and who consider then creating their own UCITS and merging those funds. So that shows that if you're a US manager in the first stage, you don't have distribution in Europe, it might pay to go on one of the UCITS platforms to grow the sub-funds and then to set up your own structure. And there are a number of those examples that have been successful. Now, truth is that you also have examples of funds that have not been successful. And in particular, when they are hosted on a platform, they don't have the same control. There's probably not the same commitment at the level of the US managers, so they don't necessarily put the same efforts into making it successful. You see that US managers, and if you take the example of AQR has been tremendously successful in alternatives because they had their own platforms and they've devoted the efforts to organize distribution across Europe, etc. But they started by being on someone else's platform. But so that is an example where I think that's the ultimate goal. And indeed, the risk, like in many things, is that if you start small, that you remain small. If you don't think big, you will remain small. And so that is a risk, but I feel that it could be addressed. It's still for a manager that only expects in a first stage to raise 40 million, 60 million without any real prospects to grow. But reality is that it's easier to be on someone else's platform.
Yeah, I don't see platforms as a good solution for AIFs. Certainly not if it's multi-asset type of solution, because it is not one size fits all in that world. And looking at service providers, for service providers that can handle liquid alternatives better than illiquid alternatives, and the fact that you have to take it all from parties that are predefined, you have no choice to pick the best selection of people working on your fund. I think that's not optimal in an environment where the asset classes require such a different sort of service providers. A hedge portfolio and a venture capital portfolio are 2 completely different things. If you want to put them on one platform, I really don't believe in it. From a service provider perspective, I've always seen platform as something I didn't want to get involved in. And so if I look from an administration perspective, if you're very much into technology and so on, you don't want to have 20 accounts on a platform of an average of 25 million. You can't make any money on that. And if you want to make money on it, you make it extremely expensive, and then you come again to the high hurdle for small funds, small managers to start a business.
There, I have a question for you, Luc. I must say, I see 2 types of service providers in Luxembourg. Those who insist on having minimas at the level of each sub-fund, and those who accept to only have minimas at the level of a relationship. And of course, not having sub-funds at the level of, not having minimums at the level of sub-fund allows managers, either small managers or big managers, but to test strategies, to take risks, and without a high TER. I do understand that if the sub-funds are too small, it's probably a lot of work for service providers, but what is your take on that? And is it not something to be encouraged to indeed allow new strategies, if not new managers, to grow?
Yes, but. And I've done both. So I've done the relationship minimums, and I've done funds, sub-fund or fund by fund minimums. I think you always, at the end, you want to be profitable. You don't want to work and not be profitable on a relationship. So if you think that there's a fair chance, either a platform or a client starting up a number of very small platforms that require quite a bit of work and won't generate any revenues, you're not going to go for a relationship sort of fee. That doesn't work because at the end you need to be able to pay for the people and for the technology. And if it's a heavy lifting type of strategy, that at the end should be the start of every fee discussion. Assess how much time you're going to spend and what technology solutions you need to use. And that should determine the fee. If you can do it for a relationship level because it's big enough, or you know that a manager will never start something under 50 million, fine. But if you know that someone can try something out at 5 million, which would give you perhaps 10,000 euros per annum revenues, while it costs you 50,000, you're not going to do that. So it depends. Understand what you get in front of you and then determine what you can do.
Paul, from the investment management point of view, do you feel the issue facing smaller managers is mainly financial, or is it more that it's just too cumbersome, or is it 50-50? What is your experience with, well, first of all, with your own business when it was smaller, but managers that you now come across who might be knocking on your door?
Yeah, a couple of reflections first. I think Jerome said, there is a lot of attraction for new managers to come to Luxembourg. Of course, it's a great stamp of credibility, and you can use that in a lot of positive ways. So that's a starting point. But realistically, we have, through will or design, created something quite complex. So if you're coming externally, you're not going to be able to understand all of that complexity. And that's why I think they end up in situations where they either don't understand everything that's required, or they completely rely on a third party and then maybe pay a lot for that. But in terms of their options, I don't think there is any option right now, unless you have really deep pockets or a really good supporter, or a very good track record, or something which can sort of really show a very, very strong asset raising potential. You need to start on a platform. I don't think there's any other choice than that. And I think it is a difficult game, as we said, about the distribution constraints, and the marketing constraints being on a shared platform. But it's the only, in my mind at least, reasonable, cost option that's available. And then you grow, and then you hope at some point you can jump. And you do see from institutional investors that they quite often don't prefer or will not invest in a sub fund on a shared platform. They understand the complexities, and maybe from their point of view, some of the risks associated with investing that way, and would rather see that it's its own CCAF with its own board and so on. So I think if you do want to jump and keep growing and keep being successful, you need to start with a platform, and then you need to branch out on your own as soon as you've reached critical mass of AUM.
What I see, but I really don't know if it's mere luck or else, but what is funny is, do you have managers who might struggle for like 6, 7, 10 years, and then they just happen to be the flavor of the day. And the reality is that it's not the costs that have gone down. It's not that they had such outstanding performance. It's not that they have a better distribution network. It's just that, you know, they happen to be in Indian mid-caps, and Indian mid-caps are the flavor of the day during a year. And so they go from 70 million to 3 billion. And then they usually, at least in the case I have in mind, they're still there like 5 years later. So in a way, there's like something that makes it appealing. You're on the map, and it's not necessarily due to what you've done. But obviously, you must have done something right. You must have kept in difficult times, and be a specialist in a relevant asset class. But it's funny that many never manage to do that step up, but you have a good number of examples where it is the case. Like, again, as Paul was saying, East Capital is clearly not a small manager. They're managing several billion. But in your case, Paul, East Capital is, or has historically been an expert on investing in Russia. And obviously Russia is currently not the flavor of the day and has not been for a while, but it's just a question of having a shift, and then you will probably be immensely successful again on that strategy. Fortunately, you diversified by now.
Very, very good point. Participants, please do ask questions or make observations using the Q&A button. We will want to hear your opinion or answer your questions. Can I ask the panel, is Luxembourg well positioned as a jurisdiction versus competitors like obviously Dublin, but maybe also smaller places now like Malta or Jeroen, you wanna comment on that?
Can start. I think we always have to be aware of competition, and well, it's a general say, but I do think that competition is healthy. Reality is that Malta or Cyprus, that at some stage could be seen as competition, are not, and are very unlikely to be, because what has appeared is that they're facing too many difficulties, including in the case of Malta, not having enough depositories. Well, you might know that there's an initiative for at the level of ESMA for a depository passport, which is pushed by countries like Malta, because one of the solutions to be able to service Maltese funds is for foreign depositories to act in their jurisdiction. Of course, the Swiss could have done something amazing, and they've really shot themselves in the foot. Countries like the UK going forward could be doing something. Of course, in Asia, we're always very careful to follow the various initiatives there. But the reality is that I think the main jurisdictions are still always the same and are likely to be the same for a while. It's Ireland in Europe, and of course the Cayman Islands and possibly Singapore outside of Europe. But I think we are doing very well on alternatives because we've been acting fast, we've been innovative with our RAVs, and in particular with our partnerships. The growth in Luxembourg, which is not necessarily visible to everyone, is that like 8 projects out of 10 are, and I'm not talking about existing promoters creating new sub-funds, but I'm really talking about new structures from new promoters. And 8 out of 10 are in that space, and especially in the PRE infrastructure and debt spaces. And so that has been extremely successful. In terms of assets, it is not huge because usually those strategies require having commitments and deploying capital over time. But it is in terms of growth, in terms of future success, it's very important. On the UCITS side, we're still doing well, but that's, I think, where we need to be. We need to put our act together. Ireland is growing fast, and we need to address certain issues like ESG, maybe the cost issue, efficiency issues, including time to market from the CSF, etc. There, I think that is where we should put all our efforts to remain the leading jurisdiction.
Yeah, I would agree completely. I think, you know, we are well established now. We've been in Luxembourg for 7 years, and obviously a lot of the regulations come during that period, and we find it difficult to navigate. And I can't imagine what it would be like for a small manager entering. So I think we do need to be careful not to make it too complex and certainly too costly. But I mean, if Luxembourg can do that in a good way, it will be a winner. But I mean, it's not as though let's open the floodgates and start lots and lots of small funds. But I think you do need to do a good due diligence, and when there is a good business case, they should be able to get access, you know, to Luxembourg, and Luxembourg should support them and embrace them and let them grow. And if it does so, then it's a win-win. And otherwise, I would also agree. I think that sometimes I speak to managers who are looking to start up, and they get put off by Luxembourg just because it's comes across, you know, not very hospitable and inviting, and you know, they can make it complex and come with a lot of questions and fears about, well, have you thought about that, and that's not going to be easy, and you know, bit negative. And other places will be a little bit more inviting. You know, it would be great to see if they do start, you know, how relatively successful they become, depending on which jurisdiction they choose and how they choose to set up. But certainly some are put off and therefore go elsewhere.
Yeah, Paul, just to react on this, because I don't see the big difference if you look at Ireland and Luxembourg. I think that the regulations are not the big difference. Most of the regulations are European regulations, and one regulator may focus a bit more on one area than another regulator, but I don't see that that's a real difference between Ireland and Luxembourg anymore. There may be other factors that have an impact, and that could be, for instance, cultural. That could be that our labor market has been quite tight for a very long time, with all sorts of consequences. And that may be time to market, where, yes, a regulator is a party, but there are other parties that also sometimes need more time than what I would say is really required. So I think this is not only a regulatory issue, this is much broader. And I think we need to look at other areas of our business and the way we do business in Luxembourg as well.
And is this partly also an issue of how Luxembourg presents itself to the global financial market? Paul, you mentioned that you know, there is the perception that it's difficult here sometimes, but actually, when it comes to it, maybe it's not more difficult here than it's in Dublin. Should we do a better job in Luxembourg to make managers more welcome here, because we can accommodate them? Luc, what do you think?
Listen, I think Luxembourg can be amazing in that context, but I don't think Luxembourg as a country is targeting small managers. So if you're looking, and I don't want to mention the name, but a large European manager a number of years ago had to make, after Brexit, a decision whether it would become Sweden, the Netherlands, or Luxembourg. And Luxembourg won. And that was because we were able to get the Minister of Finance and the Managing Director of the CSSF in front of the CEO of that group within 24 hours. And in the Netherlands, yeah, that's and that's my country, so I can make that comment. That will take weeks to get something like that organized, and probably not even at that level. And so I think if it's the right target, Luxembourg is amazing in these things. But again, I don't think that will ever be done for a small manager.
If I may, I like to quote Avis and Hertz, the two rental companies. You know, Avis is second, and their motto is "We try harder." And in a way, I think Ireland tries harder. And sometimes we feel that what they do is a bit low, but they try harder. And I think it's a time where we now have to, in certain cases, question things that we've done, whether it's at the level of ALFI, how we promote Luxembourg, etc. Maybe at the level of the CSF, as Luc was saying, at the level of all the service providers as well. But again, I don't think the message is that we're doing poorly. It's just that I think it's time to reinvent ourselves in many cases. And not everything is negative. For example, I think there's absolutely no doubt that out of all jurisdictions, we're the most technical jurisdiction. We're the jurisdiction where, you know, whether it's the regulator, the service providers, etc., are far more technical than other jurisdictions and with a better understanding of the issues. I'm not saying that you can't find competent people elsewhere, but overall, I think we can be proud of our level of competence. But indeed, I think, and it's not only us, and we're also bound by the international level, the EU level, but there would be a right balance in not adding constraints, not adding costs, being efficient, accepting to simplify things, to accepting to leave players decide what is best and sanction them if it was not the case, rather than micromanage them. And I think the time has come to have that kind of repositioning.
Is that a discussion that's happening in Luxembourg among market professionals, in your view? That it is time we're going to do something about it, or is it just
yes, for example, today you had a committee, a meeting of the Haut Comité de la Place. That's the advisory committee to the CSF, to the Ministry of Finance, sorry. And today they hopefully will come up with a new product. It's the L-REIT. So it's a REIT, a new type of Luxembourg structure. So fortunately, we're still trying to go ahead and to come up with new ideas. And in those forums, we're very open. And so all those of us who are present there, they are, you know, we say things. We, at the Haut Comité de la Place a few months ago, we did the exercise to speak, that was for private equity real estate, but to each of us speak to 5 or 6 of our large clients and to ask them what was positive and what was negative about Luxembourg. And so there is a conscience that we have to do better, and it's that Haut Comité de la Place that is trying to coordinate the efforts. But whether we will really achieve it, because I don't think it's a question of the minister or the CSF or the ALFI setting the pace. It is ideally a global effort, and there I don't think we're yet at that level where everyone is conscious of what the situation is.
Okay, thanks. So we have a few minutes remaining, and I haven't seen any questions pop up. I hope that the Q&A facility is actually working. Please do ask any last-minute questions if you have them, participants. If I can just come back to the sort of solutions question, I thought that the RAVE would be a solution for a small AF or a small alternative manager to launch. Luc, earlier you expressed some doubt about that. Can we spend a few minutes just talking about the RAVE and to what extent it actually does provide or not a solution for smaller managers to kick off? Luc, what is your view?
Yeah, so the reason that I doubted it was that sub-threshold, it may be easier to just have a partnership and stay completely out of any fund law in Luxembourg and become a registered AIFM, but not subject to AIFMD. The RAVE is a solution, and certainly if if you have institutional investors that require you to be subject to AIFMD, it is a very good solution. However, you have to be fully compliant with AIFMD, which is a heavier level of regulations than when you have a completely unregulated structure with the GP acting as the alternative investment fund manager.
John?
Yes, but if I can take another analogy, I think it's easier to have 5 children with 5 nannies than to have 2 children where you're alone. And in a way, the advantage of a RAIF or the disadvantage is that you need a babysitter, you need a manco, you need a depository administrative agent, etc. But operationally, I think for a foreign US manager, for example, it's quite simple. You know, they just manage their fund. Okay, just like any other fund, it's just a mandate. Whereas if you structure the fund in a manner that you don't have a babysitter, so you have a fund, a Luxembourg fund with a non-EU manager, or you have a sub-threshold fund, or you have a non-AIF, then you have no nanny and you have to do everything. You need to appoint the relevant parties for AML, you need to do the reporting, you need to be kept informed of any new developments, etc. So sometimes having a RAIF with a Luxembourg AIFM and paying a few basis points more is easier for a manager that doesn't really want to focus on the kids all the time.
And have you seen among your sort of clients RAIF being used by small managers to launch?
Yes, I think clearly, but the decision tree is either you can do a UCITS or you can't. Okay, and if you can do a UCITS, unless you're planning to have 100 or 200 million fairly quickly, then you go on a platform. If you're a non-UCITS, then the reality is that why would you do a SIF? Why would you do a CCAR unless you have a reason, okay, tax reason or else, or demand from investors? And therefore, the easiest is to do a RAIF. And in certain cases, indeed, the US manager will say, oh, but it's just for a French pension entity, or it's for a Dutch insurance group, and I don't need an AIF, or I don't need to be under AFMD. And then in that case, indeed, as Luc was saying, you can find cheaper options because the fund is not under AFMD. But the default situation is a partnership or a RAIF.
Yeah. Paul, any last observations on this point?
We launched a RAIF. I mean, it's a little bit different for us because we're also the AFM, and we have a normal SIF as well. But I mean, certainly time to market is appealing for the RAIF. I mean, actually, I do sympathise with some of Jerome's comments because you actually notice it. You lose the layer of control and emphasis on your placement memorandum, for instance, when you don't have the CSF submission. So clearly, if you go with an unregulated, you are taking on a lot of responsibility, and you need to make sure you know what you're doing so that you don't slip up along the way.
So, well, we are getting to our time limit. So, panelists, thank you very, very much for your input and wise observations. Do you have any last remarks to make before we close down? If not, thank you for participating. Thank you to all the participants for participating, and we hope to see you back at a proper live roundtable in the coming year.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.